Hello, my name is Major Mike Webb, and at the outset, let me state again that I am not an attorney, but I can confess that I did a little more than just watch one on TV. Yet, still, let me emphasize in full and complete disclosure at the outset that this is not, shall we say, legal advice, by God, so much as a common sense approach based upon what we shall frame as considerable experience and intimate familiarity with both the law, having served as the childhood protege for a prominent civil rights and criminal defense attorney, as well as with what we can fairly describe as a relevant experience with the current public health crisis pertaining to a novel coronavirus that may have escaped from a virology lab. Since in a former life, I had not only worked in strategic counterintelligence for the United States Army, but also had in that role played a critical role in launching the intelligence organization that ABC News reported last April was supposed to have alerted the former president in November 2019 about a novel coronavirus. Much more, let us just state that I can neither confirm nor deny. Find a unique delegation, shirking of responsibility from the state, both to private employers as well as educational institutions and state agencies, stating that even if the executive power will refrain, if they, in their good judgment, determine that mandatory vaccinations are proper and necessary, they are at complete liberty to do so with no further ado. Essentially also granted a privilege with the imprimatur of the state by delegation. Like the Life cereal commercial where we find the children arguing and saying, "I'm not going to eat it, give it to Mikey." But of course, these are not mere children impacting the rules that will govern your children in school. And so let us turn now in a return to this condition of disparate treatment that we discussed a little bit at the beginning, vis-a-vis other students who choose to matriculate, and other faculty, administrators, and staff who, upon receipt of a reasonable notice to terminate the employment relationship, still yet freely chose in a renegotiated employment agreement, a counteroffer to remain, subject to compliance with the new rule requiring weekly PCR testing, examining particularly the state's premier educational institution, the top of the top. And who would go down from the top? If you were a person who had refused to comply with the religious exemption, would you describe your new workplace as a welcoming environment? Well, considering the Title VII employment claim of sexual harassment in the 1986 case of Meritorious Savings Bank v. Vinson, the Supreme Court stated not all workplace conduct that may be described as harassment affects a term, condition, or privilege of employment within the meaning of Title VII. See Rogers v. EEOC, where it states that mere utterance of an ethnic or even racial epithet which engenders offensive feelings in an employee would not affect the conditions of employment to sufficiently significant degree to violate Title VII. Called you a bad Dan, go back. For sexual harassment to be actionable, it must be sufficiently severe or pervasive to alter the conditions of the victim's employment and create an abusive working environment. Respondents' allegations in this case, the court said, which include not only pervasive harassment, but also criminal conduct of the most serious nature, are plainly sufficient to state a claim for hostile environment sexual harassment. And so the question with regard to compulsory vaccinations and the persistent restrictions requiring weekly PCR testing under Title VII claim would require a showing by a complainant that the respondent uses a particular employment practice that causes a disparate impact on the basis of race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, and the respondent fails to demonstrate the challenged practice is job-related for the position in question and consistent with business necessity. Let's just pause there before proceeding. Who else is going to stay in that environment besides someone who presents a religious reason why they're not going to take the vaccine? The pertinent facts which apply to a private or public sector workplace are that at UVA, there is definitely disparate treatment for a person who applies for a religious exemption, where that religious person, because of his or her religious convictions, will be treated differently from other employees at the university. These are the facts. Leaving it to the university to establish that the vaccine requirement is consistent with a business necessity. So, thinking like a lawyer, a complainant must rebut the argument that the vaccinations are what? A business necessity. And on June 22nd, according to Dr. William Petrie, MD, not just PhD, the chair professor of the infectious diseases and international health at the University of Virginia, stated getting the vaccine is the single most important protective thing you can do. The single most important protective thing you can do. And if you are simply blown over by titles and never question a doctor, that may be good enough for you. But let's delve further into the reasoning that logically and rationally supports the good doctor's conclusion. Second guess. You see that we have in logic both reasons and conclusions. It's not just saying whatever you think. Just as in law, we have findings of fact that support conclusions of law. And on June 22nd, the relevant time reference, since as you may recall from the famous DACA decision from last summer by the Supreme Court in DHS v. Board of Regents for the University of California, judicial review of agency action is limited to what? The grounds that the agency invoked when it took the action. Dr. Petrie replied in an interview in UVA Today News, the risk is really among unvaccinated individuals. The risk is really? Is there any other kind? The risk is really among unvaccinated individuals. The mRNA vaccines made by Pfizer and Moderna appear to protect quite well against the Delta variant, and particularly against hospitalization. Data I have seen, he said, from England, which is pre-publication or not peer-reviewed, shows that the Pfizer vaccine was 94% protective against hospitalization. The AstraZeneca vaccine, which is an adenovirus-based vaccine similar to the Johnson & Johnson one-shot vaccine in the U.S., was about 92% protective against hospitalization. That is great news, the good doctor said. And if you are fully vaccinated as an employee or student at UVA, perhaps that should be great news to you. Because if an unvaccinated and infected person happened to enter your presence, you're sitting in a safe place, like the Federation ship USS Enterprise with shields upright. Or is the doctor stating that the vaccines simply do not work and that you are, in fact, at risk, despite this 92% protectiveness from being hospitalized? If vaccinated persons are at risk from unvaccinated persons, why is there a mandate for persons to get vaccinated? Is the public health policy perhaps to prevent unvaccinated persons who decide to remain in this disparate treatment from infecting others who also decide to be non-compliant and remain? Note that under Title VII, a demonstration that an employment practice is required by business necessity may not be used as a defense against a claim of intentional discrimination under this subchapter. Who else is going to remain in a workplace but for a religious exemption? And this is an important point. In fact, the vaccines are as effective as they have been advertised to be. This should be a very, very important point. But also, particularly at UVA, that boasts of being a primary partner in the governor's COVID-19 response, helping to do a lot of the modeling, as well as the former employer for the state health commissioner. Under a Title VII claim for employment discrimination, it may be pertinent that under the law, it shall be unlawful employment practice for an employer to print or publish or cause to be printed or published any notice or advertisement relating to employment by such an employer, indicating any preference, limitation, specification or discrimination based on race, color, religion, sex, or national origin, except that such a notice or advertisement may indicate a preference, limitation, specification, or discrimination based on religion, sex, or national origin, when religion, sex, or national origin is a bona fide occupational qualification for employment. Consider for a moment, role play. Consider for a moment the plight of the Jewish people in the ghettos, like Warsaw, Poland, during the Holocaust, removed from their former homes, placed in isolation from the rest of the community, and compelled to wear upon their clothes a yellow star, with the star denoting the religious symbol of the Star of David, but also in the color of yellow, which for centuries has been associated with quarantine from contagion. Essentially persecution of these persons because of their religion, even though you could argue that it was not, because they were trying to protect themselves from a disease. And they were described for all to see as pestilence in those communities, an infectious contagion whose spread had to be mitigated and controlled. Consider working, going to work, going to school, reporting to work each day to subject yourself to that workplace environment. But then it also at UVA, not only being a person who has been determined to be a public health threat, a danger to others, but also subjected to constant messages and reminders that those persons who remain non-compliant represent an existential threat to the entire community. And this word coming from the experts for the state. You're at ground zero. You are a Jew living in Berlin. A threat from a validated less than 5% infectious pathogen, with a case fatality rate in the Commonwealth of only 1.7%. Can it be reasonably argued that the university's vaccine policy has been reasonably calculated to prevent the spread of COVID-19, or simply remove those who are non-compliant and refuse to go along with the rule? You be the judge. This briefing is unclassified, as you will. My name is Major Mike Webb, and by God, I am running for Arlington Public School Board. Let's keep Mike Webb away from our schools. Honest. Carry on. This advertisement was authorized by Mike Webb.